Our terrific presenter this morning is Dr. Marilyn Sanders. She is a board-certified pediatrician neonatologist who cares for critically ill babies, infants, and their families at the Connecticut Children's Medical Center Newborn Intensive Care Unit in Hartford. Dr. Sanders did her pediatric residency at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine and her fellowship in Neonatal-Perinatal Medicine at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. She's a professor of pediatrics at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. She also provides neurodevelopmental follow-up for babies and infants up to 3 years old. We welcome Dr. Sanders this morning on behalf of DEMAS and the Connecticut Women's Consortium. Dr. Sanders, take it away.
So my only disclosure is that I am a published author of W.W. Norton and Company. So today we're going to talk about a number of things, and I'm sort of going to divide this into two, and I'll take questions at the end of the first portion of this presentation. Initially, we're going to talk about what we expect sort of in more typical environments, typical dyads, typical pregnancies. And then in the second half of the presentation, I'm going to be focusing more on maternal infant dyads affected by substance misuse. So we are going to today talk about the role of the automatic or unconscious nervous system in our feelings and behaviors. We're going to talk about 3 states of awareness of the unconscious nervous system, and we're going to describe 2 interventions that positively impact the relationship of the mother and recovery and her infant. So as we move through today's presentation, there's sort of a bottom line that I hope you walk away with, and that would be that by the time we finish talking today, my hope is that you understand that moving from a perspective of what's wrong with you to what happened to you is key to supporting mothers and their non-birthing partners in recovery, as well as their infants. A number of you have probably seen this beautiful quotation from Thupten Jinpa, a Buddhist monk, and he talks about how we were born at the mercy of someone else's care. We grew up and survived into adulthood because we received care from others. This little study is a wonderful sort of preamble to what we're going to be talking about today. Silk, Alberts, and Altman did a study of 16 years of behavioral data from Kenyan wild baboons. So they literally were in the Kenyan wild forests for 16 years. And they developed what they called a sociality index of the baboon mothers. And one of the interesting things, though perhaps not surprising to this particular population of listeners, is that a higher sociality index among the mothers was an excellent predictor of infant survival. And as you can see over here on the axis, that the longer the babies survived, the better the mother's sociality index. So that speaks to the issue that we're also familiar with now, which is the downside risks of loneliness and lack of social engagement. And that is a mammalian function, not just reserved to humans. So as we begin this talk, let's talk about the evolutionary biology of the autonomic nervous system. Some of you may think of this as the automatic nervous system or the unconscious nervous system. And this is that part very, very deep buried in the brain that governs our most vital functions, including our breathing and heart rate. And it's very interesting. If you look at the evolution of this deep portion of the brain from vertebrates up to mammals, what we see is that if you look at the far left here, at very early vertebrates. When very early vertebrates felt threatened, they had only one possible response, and that was to immobilize, to stay still, to feign death, and to hope that the predator would simply go away. They had no capacity to actually mobilize a response. And that particular level of response is governed by something called the parasympathetic dorsal vagal complex. The vagal nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, and it is involved in things like moderating our heart rate and our respirations. And so for the reptile, all they could do was to simply be still. Now, as we come up the evolutionary ladder, for example, to fish, we see that the sympathetic nervous system comes online, what you guys know as the fight or flight reaction. So that for fish and other higher order vertebrates, what we see is that they could actually get away, or if they were a bigger fish, a predator fish themselves, could actually stay in place and fight. And that, of course, is governed by the sympathetic nervous system. But only mammals seen on the right, have the capacity for social engagement when they feel threatened. And this is true of all mammals. Now, what's also interesting is that because this is an evolutionary hierarchy, mammals, at least mammals who have been cared for well, will initially, when they feel threatened, try to socially engage. If social engagement fails them, then they will mobilize into a fight or flight response. And only when they are so overwhelmed that they can neither engage nor flee or fight will they become immobilized. So mammals then, in their attempts to be safe and social, can develop what we know as social connectedness. And I'm going to use social connectedness in a very specific way in the course of this discussion. Social connectedness, to Stephen Porges, who was the developer of what's called the polyvagal theory, which is this evolutionary hierarchy that I just talked about, describes social connectedness as the ability to mutually, that is synchronously and reciprocally, regulate both physiological and behavioral state. And I'll pause here for just a moment to point out that Dr. Porges talks a lot about physiological regulation, not just behavioral regulation. And this sets him apart from many other people who speak about social connection. So what happens when mammals are threatened? Well, as we know, the limbic system, which is that portion very, very deep inside your brain, is constantly scanning your environment for evidence of danger. You see this when you go into a room where you may not know people. What's the first thing you do? You look around the room to see if there's someone there that you know so that you can socially engage. Obviously, for us on Zoom today, it's a very different scenario, but think about the last time you went to a face-to-face meeting and how this played out for you. And the limbic system is that portion which contains these very, very deep elements that I was referring to. For example, the amygdala, which is the alarm system for the autonomic nervous system, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, which is where memories are stored. And then, of course, what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is that area below the frontal cortex at the top of the brain, the thinking portion, which is in charge of essentially moderating, modulating threat, organization, planning. If you can't get to your prefrontal cortex, then all you do is stay in a limbic loop of danger. So you've heard about people, for example, going limbic or going postal. Well, those are people who typically are either so terrorized or traumatized that when they sense a threat, they simply cannot get out of their own limbic system. So Dr. Porges has given a specific name to this sense, this unconscious sense. It kind of sounds like an oxymoron, but when you think about this, this is how the deepest parts of your brain respond to whether you feel safe, in danger, or in a life threatening situation. And you kind of know this in terms of how you feel in terms of, for example, your body responses when you are in a new or novel or some situation that is stressful for you. And it's a combination of things that are going on in your external environment. So it might be noises, it might be lights, it might be things that you are seeing in the periphery of your nervous system, then modulated by your internal environment. And together, those create a neuroception, or a sense of whether you are safe, whether you are in danger, or whether you are in a life-threatening situation. And it is that that's going to govern your behavior. And what I want you to see when you look at these arrows go back and forth. So you can feel safe initially and very quickly feel like you are in danger. Likewise, you can feel like, oh, maybe I'm just a little uneasy, and then something happens and you go into a life threat situation. And a lot of this sense and how you deal with novelty is going to be based upon your past experience. So imagine, for example, as we'll talk later about dyads that are affected by substance misuse, think about how often those individuals either can't hit safety at all, or very quickly go from safety to danger or even life threat, and how that's going to impact their behaviors. So neuroception, as I mentioned, is the unconscious awareness of safety, danger, or life threat. So we talk a lot about nourishing the human brain, and particularly nourishing the infant brain. Most of what we talk about, of course, at least in my circles in the medical world, is food. So we talk about breast is best. We talk about supplements that people take for brain development. We talk about whether formulas should be should have additives, for example, like DHA and ARA. We talk about the microbiome. We talk about all of these things as essentially promoting better development. But what we don't spend as much time talking about is experience, and how experience moderates brain growth, brain health, social emotional development, and overall well-being. So once again, thinking together about how a neuroception will drive our feelings and behaviors, let's look next at what safety, danger, and life threat look like for infants and young children. Well, I don't have to tell you this is safety, right? You know it, you see it, you can see it in the beautiful open face of the mother, you can see it in the baby's rapt attention on the mother's face. You don't have to know anything about infants to know that this mother and this baby in this moment are feeling safe and engaged with each other. And when you are in a safe situation, you are available for social engagement. You see it in facial expression. You see it in vocalizations. When you are feeling safe, you can listen. Safety fosters calm by inhibiting the sympathetic influences, for example, the epinephrine surges, the catecholamine surges, and also blunts the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is the origin of cortisol, the stress hormone. And of course, when you are feeling safe, you can become securely attached and develop love relationships as well. Now, what happens if you sort of slide down the ladder in terms of safety into mobilization, fight or flight responses? Well, the sympathetic nervous system gets involved. And when we have sympathetic arousal, we have dilated pupils so that we can see a wider field. Our excretory functions are inhibited. It mobilizes our muscles. And babies can essentially portray their mobilization fight or flight responses by doing things like crying, protesting, or even gaze aversion. But it's only when babies sink, having tried social engagement, having tried mobilization, to a level at which they are feeling imminently in danger for their very lives, that they immobilize. They become vegetative, passive, reflexive. They shut down. They try and blend into their environment. For infants, they may have loss of muscle tone, have a sense of despair or apathy. For the older child or adult, they may have fainting episodes. They may have feigning death episodes. They may have, in the clinical sense, absolute dissociation. What we have to keep in mind is that there is not a value associated with these particular states. Yes, of course, we want people to feel safe. But what we have to understand is, depending upon the environment, the internal and external sensory environments, and past experience, people will potentially go into sympathetic arousal, fight or flight, or life threat or immobilization behaviors, because what their autonomic nervous system is telling them is that social engagement isn't working, sympathetic activation isn't working, you are in a life-threatening situation, and perhaps you should just be as still as you can possibly be. So with that background, let's move on to talking about how it is that infants and young children develop relationships that promote survival through safety, security, and connectedness. So what I like to think of is the work of the different trimesters of pregnancy. So in the first trimester of pregnancy, essentially you've got a baby in the womb, and the work of that trimester is essentially building the organ systems that will support life later on. In the second trimester, those organs get bigger, they grow in a typical environment, and typically toward about the last few weeks of the second trimester, which ends at about 24 weeks, mothers begin to have mental representations of their fetuses. And most women associate that with beginning to feel movement. In the third trimester, there's continued development of the organ states, and mothers, parents, continue to have more and more mental representations, more mature mental representations. They will attribute certain behaviors and characteristics to their particular fetus. And then, of course, we have this abrupt transition to labor and delivery. So what I like to think of is that the work of the fourth trimester, which is the first 100 days after birth, the parental relationship is now the second womb. That is now the relationship in which the baby, the young infant, should begin to feel safe and secure. And as she gets older, begin to be able to tolerate novelty and moving out of, over time, a sort of cocoon of the early relationship. So we have to talk, of course, about the biological expectancies of the human newborn or young infant. Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, there is no question that we were born and bred to go from essentially the perineum, which is where we make our entry into the world to breast or chest. That is simply the way that we have evolved. We've evolved that way because it's very clear that young infants need the protection of adult caregivers for survival and thriving. So it doesn't matter whether you are a young infant born in a first world country or a young infant born in an underdeveloped country, your biological expectancy is that you will go immediately to chest and breast. Now, thinking more specifically about the expectations of newborns and young infants from their caregivers, they expect that their caregivers, and please understand, this is not cognitive, okay? This is at that autonomic level. They expect that their caregivers be in both emotional and physical proximity. They expect that they be sensitive and attuned to their needs. They expect to be able to engage in contingent responsiveness. So the baby makes a move, the caregiver makes a move, which then causes a response in the baby, and they go back and forth and back and forth in a typical relationship in that dyadic responsiveness. And then over time, they expect that this social engagement that they have leads to social connectedness. And once again, we're talking about social connectedness in terms of regulating both physiologic and behavioral state. So when biological expectancies are met, human infants feel safe. And when human infants feel safe, they can socially engage. So this takes us, of course, to a discussion of attachment. I don't know how many of you know the history of Bowlby's attachment theory, but it's really very interesting. Bowlby was a psychologist, psychoanalyst in the child guidance clinics, as they were called, which basically were psychiatric mental health facilities in the United Kingdom in the 1930s and 1940s. And in one of his child guidance clinics, he noted that of what they called juvenile thieves who were taken care of there, that the vast majority of these young boys, and they were all males, had had some separation of at least 6 months from their mother at less than 5 years of age. And from that understanding, Bowlby began to think about, well, what is it about the mother-infant relationship that would cause boys who had been separated from their mothers for a substantial period of time to end up in the juvenile justice system? And from there, he developed his theory of attachment. And attachment, as we know, is goal-directed, it's instinctive, proximity-seeking behavior. So in a typical situation, babies, infants, and their adult caregivers will be drawn together in a way in which together they understand at this unconscious level that what is going on here enhances the likelihood of the infant's survival. It's a product of both genetic endowment and, of course, the environment, because we know how an environment that is less than caring, less than typical, can result in not that these infants don't attach, but in an attachment that is insecure. and of course, maximizes the chances of survival of the infant. So think back to that graph that we talked about earlier, looking at sociality index of mothers and survival of babies. So in a secure attachment, which is obviously the goal, the adult caregiver becomes a secure base from whom the infant child can explore the world. Now, you might ask yourself, if you look at a typical population, for example, what percentage of the population will have a secure attachment with an adult caregiver? And across a typical population, it's about 2/3. The other third will have a variety of forms of insecure attachments, which can, over time, of course, either become more secure or less secure. In a typical population, typical environment, for infants who have a secure attachment, if you look at them over time, by and large, those secure attachments, they continue to be older children and adults with secure attachments. If, however, you look at individuals who have insecure attachments, they can potentially become more disorganized and more harmful over time in terms of basic health and well-being. So the attachment is based upon, among other things, the infant or child developing what's called a working model of relationships. So we develop our working model of relationships based upon the way that we are treated. So if the primary caregiver or caregivers treat the child as if the child has value, is worthwhile, then the child's working model of herself typically is one that will be secure. So, I live in a positive environment. I know that I'm loved. Everything may not be rosy every moment of every day, but the bottom line is that I feel worthwhile. I feel worthy of being cared for. On the other hand, if the model is one in which the child feels unloved and rejected, or angry and confused, then typically an insecure attachment develops. And we'll talk a little bit more in just a moment about what those look like in terms of a mother-infant dyad. But I think the primary importance of the internal working model of relationships, as Costello, who's a psychologist, talks, is that the internal working model of relationships is a guidance system. It tells us what to do and what to expect when we are with another person. They are scripts for social interaction. So as you think about this, and as you think about the population that we're talking about today, that population that has been involved with substance misuse, you have to say to yourself, what is the internal working model of self that these mothers often have? So Beatrice Beebe is a marvelous psychologist and psychoanalyst who has done a lot of work with mothers and young infants. For the most part, she looks at mom-infant dyads anywhere from about 4 months to 12 months of age. And she does this with micro video analysis. So Beebe will video these mothers and their babies together in typical interactions. It breaks down to, I think it's 0.2 seconds. And what Beebe has noted in looking at these mothers and babies is that attachment can look very different depending upon how the mother interacts with the baby. So in a kind of best case scenario situation, when mother and baby, and this is for those of you who know this, she does basically the still face, where the mother interacts normally with the baby and then will turn her face from the baby and looks at what the baby's response is. And for those of you who have seen a still face video, it takes very little time for even a young baby, upon losing the mother's face, to become quite distraught. She then returns to looking at the baby and begins to engage typically again. And so in this set of, and these were typical pregnancies that she looked at, Beebe found for those mothers who were able to have a flexible balance, who were regulated in themselves and could be regulated in working with their babies, called them essentially mid-range trackers. So even when there was this disruption of the face-to-face contact, these mothers were able to repair very easily with the babies and to bring the babies back quickly. On the other hand, and those children over time, because she followed them out, tended to develop secure attachments, aka the safety neuroception that we're talking about. On the other hand, there were two other types of interactions that she noted. One was one where mothers were very preoccupied, didn't track their babies well, didn't seem to be able to attune to their babies. And these babies tended to develop insecure attachments. On the other hand, there was a group of mothers whose preoccupation led to an interactive regulation style that was a very high tracking, almost frenetic, unable to let the baby disengage because it felt to the mother as if she was sort of losing the baby. Those babies also tended to develop insecure attachments. So those were the babies who became more sympathetically mobilized from the mothers who were sympathetically mobilized, and then the babies of the mothers who were so preoccupied that they really could not focus their attention on what the baby needed and attune to what the baby needed, also had insecure attachments. And you can, I think, very easily see how this fits into that paradigm we talked about of the neuroception of safety, danger, or life threat. And I like to think of this as setting up in the optimal situation what I call the safety circuit. So when we feel safe, we can socially engage and become socially connected. And over time, when we are socially connected, we feel safe. And over time, we can have secure attachments. And of course, when we have secure attachments, even typically when there is some form of a disruption, we continue to feel safe over time. And this style, incidentally, doesn't just apply to caregivers and their infants. We tend to carry our attachment styles into adulthood. So how can we, as caregivers, impact the social engagement styles, social connectedness of mothers and their infants? Niels Bergman is a neonatologist from South Africa who now works at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. And Niels talks about how processes in the first 1,000 minutes or first 3 days after birth prepare the needs of mothers and infants in the first 1,000 days. So as we think about this, and we think about this lovely transition from in utero to ex utero, and this valuable time that we have in the hospital, with babies becoming less time over time, I must say, it is absolutely stunning to me how many babies are going home at just barely 24 hours of age now, which is a topic for another day. But let's think about that time and what is it about that time and how does it help us prepare mothers and babies for their ongoing work together. There is a very well-known psychologist by the name of Myron Hoffer. And Dr. Hoffer talked about what he called hidden regulators of maternal-infant interaction. And Niels Bergman elaborated on this to talk about the sensory inputs that the newly born infant gets from the mother that are critical to ongoing health and well-being. And as he says, all sensory inputs from the mother are necessary. Each has a unique impact on a specific physiological aspect collectively over different periods of time. So as we think about early relationships between mothers and babies, and we try to parse it and try to pick apart, well, what exactly is it that either makes for success or less than optimal development? As Bergman says, it's a whole package. And let's talk for a moment about what that package looks like. So his work on hidden regulators was the result of a lab accident. Dr. Hoffer did basic research with Sprague-Dawley rats. And one day he came into his animal room and found that one of his mother rats had escaped, was running around the room. And the babies were absolutely beside themselves. So he thought to himself, what is going on here? What are the components of this? So he studied it. And what he found was that there was a very predictable and reproducible pattern of distress that these Sprague-Dawley rats, now a rat pup, the gestation for a rat is about 20 days. So as you can imagine, we sort of have to think about this and extrapolate to the human environment to the extent we can. But the first thing that he noted is that when the mother was taken away, the babies immediately went into this very intense ultrasonic vocalization activity. And that was over about, the first hour or so. And then after that, over about a 24-hour period of time, they had, as you can see in the top, release of corticosteroid, which is essentially cortisol, the stress hormone. They became very behaviorally reactive, aka sympathetically mobilized. They began engaging in intense sucking behaviors, which are behaviors to attempt to self-soothe. And by the same token, if you look under at the bottom of this particular schematic, you see that things like their growth hormone, which is important to their well-being, their sleep, and their ability to stay warm were all affected over time. So what you essentially see is a sort of physiologic manifestation of what we've been talking about, that when separated, they first become behaviorally reactive, and then over time, even basic functions like the ability to stay warm are affected. So they slide down that evolutionary hierarchy that we're talking about, from safety to danger to life threat. Hoffer then said to himself, well, how can I make this better? What can I do to attenuate this? The first thing that he did was he put a rubber rat in there with a battery, saying, well, is it just some kind of form and some warmth? And there was no attenuation at all. The next thing he did was to put something soft and furry in there. Maybe that's what they need, the kind of skin dermal sensory experience. There was some attenuation. But it was only when he had warmth, something soft, and the shavings from the rat cage, which of course basically had the mother's scent on them, that he was able to have complete attenuation. So as he pointed out, this is a package of sensory experiences that the newly born mammal needs to be in a system or to have a felt sense of safety. When we think about the human environment, the highest order of mammals, or so we think, there has actually been a lot of research looking at what we call the sacred hours, which is the recommendation that all babies go skin to skin with the mother for at least 1 uninterrupted hour after birth. Forget about the weights, forget about the vitamin K, forget about the eye drops. Give that mother and that baby an hour together with nobody trying to do anything. What they have found is that you see increased physiologic stability of the dyad. It promotes maternal attachment behaviors. It protects against negative effects of maternal-infant separation. It promotes optimal brain development and increases breastfeeding rates and durations. So Niels Bergman has directed us to think about, instead of neuroscience, which of course was the fad of the 1990s, the decade of the brain, we were going to figure it all out and everybody was going to have optimal development and health, that if we think instead of nurture science, our focus would be on the first several days after birth, as opposed to thinking that we have so much time. 3 years is a long period of time in a mother-infant relationship. In terms of the regulatory mechanism, we think about co-regulation as opposed to self-regulation. Babies don't regulate themselves. They regulate in relationship with an adult caregiver. In terms of emotional learning, we think about the autonomic nervous system less than the frontal cortex. When we think about the intervention target, we're talking about boosting this calming activity as opposed to tempering excitability and sympathetic activity. The key outcomes for nurture science are emotional connection and resilience, as opposed to attachment and cognition. And I think very, very importantly, over time, the key long-term objectives are relational health and interdependence, as opposed to self-actualization and independence. So when we think about a typical mother-infant dyad, the science writer Winifred Gallagher in the 1990s had a beautiful article in which she talked about mother and offspring live in a biological state that has much in common with addiction. When they are parted, the infant does not just miss its mother. It experiences a physical and psychological withdrawal from a host of her sensory stimuli, not unlike the plight of a heroin addict who goes cold turkey. I don't know how many of you have seen this beautiful video, but I think it beautifully illustrates exactly what we're talking about in terms of this type of absolute draw of the mother and infant to each other. And this is a little snippet from a video of a mother chimpanzee who got reunited with her baby 2 days after her emergency cesarean section.
Oh my God.
Good job, Holly. What a good girl.
So that's what it looks like when it's good, right? This immediate draw to each other, this almost addictive type behavior, as we're discussing, because this is what, in a typical situation, mothers and their infants will do and will need from each other and bring to each other. Whoops, I need to do that. So the impact of maternal-infant separation is the result of absence or withdrawal of maternal regulation on infant arousal. So we, as the adult caregivers, regulate the infants that we birth, right? And when we separate mother and infant, what we're basically doing is essentially separating an infant from his or her lifeline, not just in the physiological response, but in the emotional, social response as well. And I think that is sort of the first part that I wanted to chat about, and subsequently we will go into a more specific discussion of mothers and infants affected by substance misuse. So I'm going to stop share for a moment here for a few minutes, Sheila, and take questions. That'll work, right? Okay.
Sounds terrific.
So how do you want to do this? Do people want to raise hands, or can you help me with this, Sheila? It's probably easier for you to note it than me.
Of course. So anybody that has anything that they want to share with Dr. Sanders, you can either put it in the chat, raise your hands, or unmute and ask her directly.
Okay, so it looks like DeLeon has raised her hand.
Perfect.
Hi, Dr. Sanders. Great presentation. There's so many things that you hit on in what you presented so far. That was like really great. One of the things was the New York Times actually last month, I'm not sure if you saw this, August 22nd, they released a article that talked about a common misunderstanding about sexual assault. Because a lot of times people often say, for someone who's been assaulted, why didn't you run? Or why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you do that? And so what it highlighted was the fact that people in that level of threat often do default back to that very primal response, which you showed so great, in the presentation as to how evolution has helped for us to respond differently. However, depending on the level of threat, you can get to that point of freezing. And in the article, it has a number of different people that responded and saying, like, I froze. And of course, based on what you said, you expect that if there's nothing that you can do, that maybe if you lay still, your predator will, stop the attack. While we know that to not always be true, I just thought it was really great that, the synergy of the article and it bringing forward the piece of asking, what happened to you, and recognizing that it's not that that person wants to be frozen, but it's a part of the reaction, I thought was great. The other piece of your talk that I found really interesting was the highlight of a book that I'm reading called The Power of Discord. And in that book, it talks about that same freezing by Beebe that talked about, the importance of interaction. And if you don't give that interaction, that it can create a very uncomfortable situation for babies, to the point where they tried to do this study with adults and then felt guilty when they saw how it felt to be that level of ignored or have someone so disengaged. that they felt bad that they ever even did it to the baby, but how they kind of said that, it was okay and it wasn't, a negative thing that they were doing to harm the baby, was to compare it to how many times as parents people disengage, whether they're on their phone, whether they're on their computer. And so to show that that's oftentimes what children are exposed to anyway. So there's a number of different things, but I know there's quite a bit of us on the call, so I just wanted to thank you.
So a couple of things, my head is exploding with the comments that I would want to share. First of all, you are absolutely right about sexual assault and the freeze response. I can't believe I haven't read this until now, but I would recommend to all of you, if you have not read it, please read Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. It's a very political book. It is a very disturbing book in many ways. It was written first in the 1980s, and Judith Herman does exactly that when she discusses traumas at several different levels. She talks about sexual assault. She talks about combat veterans, and she talks about individuals kept in prolonged captivity. And I do believe that she was one of the very first mental health professionals, she's a psychiatrist, to essentially liken the sexual assault situation to other kinds of traumatic experience. And she took a lot of heat for that. And I think we more or less, at least in many communities, sort of kind of take that for granted at this point, because we've come a long way. But there is no question at all in my mind that if somebody had a knife to my throat, I would just be doing whatever it was that they wanted me to do to save my life, no question. In terms of the social disengagement, mothers on their phones, fathers on their phones, grandmas on their phones, whatever, all of us on our phones, it's very disturbing. I do want to also, however, bring that back around to remind us that there are always disruptions in adult caregiver, infant-child relationships. And Ed Tronick, the psychologist, talks about disruption and repair. So a momentary disruption is going to be okay as long as the repair is sufficient. But when we think, for example, when you were talking, am I pronouncing this correct? DeLeon?
You've made me French with DeLeon, but it's really just DeLeanne.
Oh, DeLeanne.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to francophile you. So I think so often about those Romanian orphans and those horrible pictures that we all have seen, and keep in mind of these children who had, they had food, they had clothing, they had heat, but they lacked human engagement. And thinking about those tragic faces, looking back as people started going into those environments, is a constant reminder to me that social engagement is essentially food for the brain, and it's food that the brain simply cannot do without.
I think the one thing I haven't heard you mention yet, and it's maybe coming, is RAD.
Is what? I'm sorry?
RAD.
Reactive attachment disorder. I'm not going to specifically talk about reactive attachment disorder. But certainly, yes. And certainly for those children in the, there were so many Americans who thought that they were going to adopt these children and bring them into their loving homes, and that life was just going to get better. But for many of those children who had been so severely neglected and did indeed have reactive attachment disorder, boy, coming back from that, it's a journey. It's a real journey.
Dr. Sanders, Stephanie Zanker Rivera has a question for you.
Sure. I'm just trying to find faces. Yes.
Good morning, Dr. Sanders. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I have to say that video I was brought to tears, having sort of had an experience. But my question is, so I am the mom of a preemie NICU baby. He's now 23 and wonderful, but I think about my early experience, right? Where not only could I not do skin to skin, I couldn't breastfeed for 5 days. I couldn't physically touch him for 5 days. And then on top of that was all of the stimulation in the NICU, the bells and the tubes and the sterile environment and the noise and the pain that from being intubated. And then on top of that, knowing now in retrospect that I was struggling with a perinatal postpartum depression and trauma. And so as a mom, right, and I had worked with NICU babies in my postdoc internship year, and I assessed NICU babies. But so I was an educated, I knew about attachment, I knew about bonding. And I just now in retrospect, I mean, how do we mitigate, right, the impact on NICU babies? And I'm super interested. I've always been interested potentially in pursuing research around that and the impact of the NICU on brain and neural development.
Yeah, well, obviously a particular interest of mine. And I think the answer to that is by promoting as much social engagement as is physically possible, as early as possible. You said your son is 23?
Yeah.
23. Okay. Well, the NICU has changed in 23 years.
Okay.
And at least in my NICU, babies go skin to skin very quickly after birth, even very tiny babies, even babies who are intubated. We do everything that we can to have families as physically involved with their babies as possible. First of all and foremost, promoting the parent as the primary caregiving relationship is absolutely critical. I've never had a NICU baby, but I have certainly cared for and spoken to hundreds of thousands of parents, I guess, who have had NICU babies, and the overwhelming sense of if we're not really mindful of this, that parents can get of it's not even my baby anymore, is very distressing. This is really a talk in and of itself, and it's a talk to give. But the world is better. We need to constantly remind ourselves of that. The language that we use in the NICU is absolutely critical. And it's a talk in and of itself, and it's a talk I give. It's called Whisked Away.
And I would love to see, whether it exists, social workers embedded in the NICU who are trained in advanced PMAD and working with families. That I just think that it may be happening, but I didn't have that resource.
Yeah, we have very talented social workers, and also neonatology is moving in the direction of embedding mental health clinicians.
Awesome.
Which is absolutely critical.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anything else before I move on? Okay, I will take that as a move on. So I'm going to share my screen again. All righty. Everybody see it? Yeah. Okay. So the topic of today, which is mothers with substance misuse. So we ask ourselves, first of all, how might social connectedness and attachment differ when a mother-infant dyad is affected by substance misuse? As I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, even in the best of relationships, disruptions occur. Disruption is stressful. Chronic disruption is traumatic. Life is stress. There is no life without stress. It is called death. And fortunately, stress does not have to be harmful, because every time a child experiences some novelty, or we experience some novelty, there is some degree of stress involved. And the work of Jack Shonkoff, who is a developmental pediatrician, has developed this very nice little stress hierarchy that I like to use. So there's positive stress. Think about an infant who accomplishes something that he or she has never been able to do before. They get that toy, across the room. Well, in the context of accomplishing the motor task that that baby needs to do, his heart rate is going to go up, his cortisol is going to go up briefly. But if that infant is scaffolded by a caring adult, then even though there is a momentary stress involved, that child is going to continue to feel safe. The next on the stress hierarchy is what we would call tolerable stress. This is what I hope in best case scenarios NICUs are: serious temporary stress responses buffered by supportive relationships. So, I'm proud of what we do in neonatology, but the fact of the matter is that there is simply no getting around the fact that we stress infants in the course of caring for them. And whether that is a tolerable stress or a toxic stress is going to depend upon the buffering that that baby gets from parents, extended family, professional caregivers. Of course, at the bottom of this hierarchy is toxic stress. And these are prolonged activations of stress response systems in the absence of protective relationships. Moving to the topic at hand, substance misuse. This is some data from SAMHSA that gives us a sense of, well, what are the dimensions of this concern, just in terms of, how many babies, how many children are affected by substance use in families. So if you look at the top red line, what you'll see is the total number of children. This was 2009 to 2014 data. Total number of children under 18 years of age, who have been affected by substance misuse in the family. And it was just under 9 million. It would be higher now. I think it would be substantially higher now, because this was before the big opiate boom. And that was about 12% of all children. So 1 in 8 children in 2009 to 2014 lived in a household that had substance misuse involved. And it's spread out fairly equally among all age groups. So about 13% of children 0 to 2, 12% 3 to 5. So if you look at it, 1 in 8 kids under 5 years of age lived in a household affected by substance misuse. And this was substance misuse across the board. This was not just opiate misuse. Likewise, if you look at those children and how many of those children had 2 parents, one parent who was the mother, one parent who was the father, you can see also that there was a significant disruption for many of these children in terms of how many parents were available in the household. So, as Thupten Jinpa says, we were born at the mercy of someone else's care. We grew up and survived into adulthood because we received care from others. Well, if you haven't been the object of someone's care and caring behavior, how can you care for another? I would assume most of you are familiar with the adverse childhood experiences literature. This is the work of Felitti, who is an internist in the Kaiser Permanente system. And he began looking in this insured population. So this is not an urban uninsured population, but began looking systematically at the persons who came into Kaiser Permanente and whether they had experienced any of these adverse childhood experiences at less than 18 years of age. They literally surveyed them. And the classic adverse childhood experiences include being frequently humiliated or rejected, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, physical neglect, whether your parents separated or were divorced, whether there was domestic violence involved, alcoholism, mental illness, and whether you had a parent who was incarcerated. And if you look, for example, at a population of mothers with opioid misuse, they reported on average 4.3 adverse childhood experiences with a range of 0 to 8. So it gives you a sense of literally what happened to these people. If you look at the literature for adverse childhood experiences, once you get at 4 adverse experiences, the likelihood that as an adult you will have premature mortality or significant chronic illness, and that includes substance misuse and other serious things, cardiovascular disease, all that kind of stuff, 60%. So these are persons who have experienced significant disruptions in their connectedness in childhood. So we move on to ask ourselves, how do mothers who have substance misuse disorders differ from other mothers in their behavior toward their infants? We have to be really careful when we talk about this, because mothers with substance misuse disorders are highly variable. There are some mothers who have substance misuse and can still parent very well. But if we look at large in populations with substance misuse, there are clear differentiations from more typical mother-infant dyads. So it takes us again to that very deepest part of the brain, which you kind of see in the center here. If we were in a room, I'd have a pointer, and you can't see my finger. But anyway, takes us to the very deepest part of the brain here, that limbic system that we talked about. And what we know is that when mothers view their own infants, there is input to their sensory nervous system, to their autonomic nervous system, that results in the production of a couple of different hormones. One is oxytocin, of course, called the love hormone, and the other one is dopamine, which is the hormone that mediates pleasure. If you look at a large population of mothers and infants who have had substance misuse involved, what you see is aberrations or changes often in how mothers respond to stress, because stress is ubiquitous, as we talked about it, and what the impact is on behavior. So in a typical situation, a mother may experience a stressor, and it could be pretty overwhelming to begin with, but then she will focus in on how to deal with that stressor, both from a day-to-day problem-solving standpoint and an emotional standpoint. And she will be attentive to her infant. She will engage in parenting behaviors. And over time, of course, these children tend to develop more secure attachments, which are associated with increased child well-being. There is no question about it that children who have secure attachments have overall better health and well-being as they age than those with insecure attachments. But what if you are a person, and of course, this applies to non-birthing partners as well. We have to be very clear about that. We're focused on mothers today, but many mothers who have substance misuse involved are also in partnerships with individuals who have substance misuse. So if, on the other hand, that stressor becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back, just one more thing that you can't deal with on top of the other stressors that you have, Or as some of you who are used to thinking about the notion of allostasis, what can happen then is that the things that might ordinarily in a different situation get the mother engaged, for example, her child's crying, instead become additional stressors that increase her allostatic load, make her less responsive potentially to her infant. And where does she then get that good stuff that helps her continue to deal with, work with, take care of a young infant, which I think any of us who have ever parented know is extraordinarily stressful at times, either on the best of, even under the best of circumstances. Then unfortunately for her, what can happen is that that can lead to increased cravings for substances, increased substance use, which of course even makes her less available to her infant's cues. And there it goes from there. Reduced engagement, more of a disengaged type of parenting behavior, an insecure attachment, and over time, decreased child well-being. We know that when typical mothers view their infants' faces, or mothers without substance misuse, it activates pathways that are associated with both oxytocin and dopamine production. Mothers with substance misuse have decreased activation of regions associated with oxytocin and dopamine to their own infant's happy face. So the cueing of my happy infant is less for them. Demands for care in these infants whose mothers have substance misuse may shift from rewarding to stressful, may then, of course, lead to increased substance use rather than the natural rewards of infant attention. It's also the case that mothers who have substance misuse do not discriminate infant facial affect as early as other mothers do. They're slower to orient to infant cries, and they fail to adaptively differentiate between high and low distress cries. So as we move along from what's wrong to what happened, when parents misuse substances, there are potential disruptions of connectedness. What we do in the first 1,000 minutes to 1,000 days can set the stage for secure attachment. The old model of working with mothers and their infants who had substance misuse involved was based upon what we called Finnegan scoring, where the infant was separated from the mother. The babies were primarily treated with narcotics. There was a prolonged hospitalization, and basically the mother picked the baby up on the day of discharge and took the baby home, and people did not live happily ever after. A newer model that I'm sure most of you are familiar with is the Eat, Sleep, Console model developed by Matt Grossman at Yale. Matt's a hospitalist. That is, he's a general pediatrician who works in the hospital. And I think it was somewhere around 2015, 2016, noting that these kids were in the hospital a longer period of time, really long period of time. He said to himself, what can we do about this? This is insane. And so he developed this model rather than relying on Finnegan scoring, which is very lengthy and difficult to replicate, a model called Eat, Sleep, Console. So the question became, can the baby eat? Can the baby sleep? Can the baby be consoled? And in the Eat, Sleep, Console model, mother and infant remain together. Mother provides the infant's care. The primary treatment is non-pharmacologic. And he found over time, and this has been replicated any number of times in different institutions now, that he reduced morphine dosing and hospital stay both very significantly. In the prior model, earlier on, 98% of the babies all got morphine. That came down to 14% of the babies. And length of stay was reduced from 22.4 days to 5.9 days. So in Eat, Sleep, Console, the focus is relationship-based, not task-oriented. mother's the medicine for her baby. Her presence, swaddling, cuddling, feeding, deciding among other things what the baby needs next, really enforcing her primary role as the most important person in her baby's life. Matt's also done some work looking at how parents respond to eat, sleep, console, and this is a relatively recent, nice little paper. 18 parents who had infants with newborn abstinence syndrome participated in structured interviews. Their demographics were similar to hospital. I think this was at Yale. About 2/3 Caucasian, 28% Hispanic, and 6% Black. And there were 5 themes that emerged. Parents, and this was mothers and fathers, liked the emphasis upon normal activities and behaviors such as feeding. All parents felt that they were active participants in their infant's care. Parents reported communication gaps from prenatal preparation. Unfortunately, I think both the medical community and the treatment, the substance abuse misuse treatment community do not do a good job of communicating to families what the expectations will be when babies are born to mothers who have had substance misuse. Parents understandably reported a lot of anxiety, stress, and guilt, and they expressed need for increased support from physicians and lactation consultants. Okay, so that brings us really to thinking about treatment for mother herself, because to simply do eat, sleep, console, and then have an infant maternal dyad go out into the community without support is not a recipe for success. Classically, the mothers have been referred to skills-based parenting programs. The challenge with these is that they focus on behavior management rather than understanding and meeting babies' emotional needs and mothers' emotional needs. They can actually increase parenting stress because they will focus on things like timeout and ignoring that may actually escalate child behavior. They're designed to address the child's symptomatology rather than the mother's, and they fail to address maladaptive attachment representations and emotional experiences as parents. So that brings us to a very successful program in the New Haven community and others called Mothering from the Inside Out, which is the work of the brilliant and sorely missed Nancy Suchman. Mothering from the Inside Out is a 12-session manualized-based therapy that's focused on enhancing the mentalizing and reflective function capacities of mothers with substance misuse. Mentalizing, for those of you who are not familiar with the terminology, is the capacity to make sense of behavior in oneself and others in terms of underlying thoughts, emotions, wishes, and intentions. In the simplest kind of parlance, it's just understanding that other people may think and feel differently than you. Reflective capacity or reflective function is the capacity to mentalize. Mothers with addiction have lower reflective function than other mothers. And in studies that have been done, reflective function mediates the relationship between substance misuse and child psychosocial outcomes. So in other words, if you have a mother who has substance misuse, but has strong reflective function, her child does better. The model of mothering from the inside out is one that has a number of different treatment components to it. There is an expectation of building a therapeutic alliance between the provider and the mother. The provider takes a mentalizing stance. She is focused upon attachment-based developmental guidance, child-focused mentalization, and maternal self-focused mentalization. And her mentalizing stance, and this is what I think is so important for the provider, is one in which she's curious and inquisitive, takes a stance of not knowing, is transparent, collaborative, and holding the child in mind. The best results of mothering from the inside out have actually been accomplished with mental health providers. Although there have also been attempts to do it with others who have primarily a substance misuse background as opposed to a mental health background, still positive results, but not as positive as when mental health providers are providing the intervention. Pardon me. So, compared to mothers who participated in a psychoeducation program, mothers who received mothering from the inside out had improvements in their reflective functioning, less negative emotionality and intrusiveness, and improvements in caregiving behaviors. And children of mothers who received mothering from the inside out had greater involvement with their mothers in dyadic interactions. And interestingly, and I think probably not surprisingly, mothers with greater addiction severity benefited the most from mothering from the inside out. So in the final couple of minutes, my question really is, well, what's our role as professional caregivers? I am not a mental health provider. I am a physician who cares for mother-infant dyads who may be affected by substance misuse in the hospital. It's very clear to me, very, very clear to me, that as professional caregivers, we do not need to be mental health experts to be a secure base for families. And I think about a beautiful paper written by Herbert Adler, who is both a psychiatrist and a family medicine doc. And Dr. Adler talked about developing provider relationships. And here he was talking about physician-patient relationships requires the person-to-person attunement that is essential for the development of the newborn. And when you think about that and think about how entering a relationship with a provider is scary, right? We go to a provider sometimes for our own well-being, but other times because something is wrong. And what are we going to hear? And how is that person potentially going to help us through navigating the information that we receive? The therapeutic caregiver, and what I'm talking about here, is not necessarily one as a mental health expert, but somebody like me, who is caring for mothers and infants who are affected, can be a secure base. If the proximity of an infant to a caregiver is critical to survival and well-being, then why can't the proximity and availability of a professional caregiver to a patient client instill a positive working model of relationships? Again, it's the what happened. These moms come to us with a history, and that history is often one of trauma, one of adverse childhood experiences, and from a resultant standpoint, one of a poor internal working model. So as we think of ourselves as professional caregivers from the inside out, I ask myself, can we build the therapeutic alliances, mentalizing stance, and give a catchment-based developmental guidance? And can we be curious and inquisitive and not knowing and transparent and collaborative, and once again, holding the child in mind? So as we think about ourselves as potentially secure bases for, I want to go back one. How can we convey safety and security to mothers and others who have had not the best start? We can maintain physical and emotional proximity. Don't have your hand on the door as you're finishing the conversation. We can explicitly state our availability. We can engage the safety circuit. It's iterative, maintaining appropriate eye contact, facial expression, soft smile, warm touch if appropriate, and their history is meaningful, and the prosody of our speech are all things that can say, I'm here, I'm interested. I'm curious. I guess in the end, thinking about all of this, hopefully moving from what's wrong with you to what happened, is a key that we can all use to supporting mothers and non-birthing partners in recovery and their infants. And I will say thank you to all of you and stop there